So this talk is basically, oh, okay. This talk is basically for that. Is really like fundamental question that we have as a conservation biologist. Obviously, we open it to the public as well because this is such an interesting topic. But what is actually nature finance, and is the promise of like selling nature to save it is actually justified, and at what scale does it really matters? Because when you read a lot of like newspaper nowadays in Indonesia context specifically, the whole market for carbon biodiversity is open up, and it's not just in Indonesia. So I have the privilege of attending Fred's lectures a few weeks ago at Nature Finance in Oxford University. So it's a global, mostly global south, the area that we still have natures and forests, but what is actually nature finance? So hopefully, in the next an hour, we're gonna have these two uh, person that really specialize in this issue, and they've been like really generous with their time, giving us 2 hours to talk about it and have questions. So without further ado, Fred, if whenever you're ready, you can start.
Sure. Well, thank you very much for inviting me here today. I will share my screen. Um, can you see my screen? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, great. So, well, biodiversity of setting, as you may all know, is really not a new idea. I mean, the way it works, I mean, you have different types of biodiversity of setting, right? The example I typically use is that a company who wants to build a new airport terminal over I don't know, elephant habitat. And there are three cases. The first case is traditional environmental regulation, where the company is told, well, no, you cannot do your airport terminal here, you need to do it somewhere else. The second case is classic biodiversity of setting, where the company will be told, well, you can do your airport, but you need to compensate by recreating elephant habitat within 10 kilometers, even though we know in reality that it's not possible in many cases to recreate all the ecosystemic functions that have been destroyed. And the third case is an extreme version of biodiversity offsetting, where the company is told, okay, you can do your airport terminal, but you need to compensate, and not necessarily by recreating a elephant habitat, but an ecosystem service of equivalent monetary value, so it can be another species, and not within 10 kilometers, but somewhere in the country or somewhere else. And this extreme version obviously has very little environmental integrity, but this is the one that is gaining traction. And the reason for that is because this is the one that enables to create a financial market around it. Because if the offsetting is tied to a specific destruction, a specific location, then you can only restore and claim to offset after the destruction takes place. Whereas if the offsetting is generic, is not tied to any specific place or destruction, then you can offset in advance, issue credits, and trade the credits, so that is buy and sell them until they're being used. And this is how you have a market. And of course, this is much worse from an environmental perspective. But this is how you create a market. And in fact, what we see in many jurisdictions, including in the UK, is somewhere a hybrid version between the two, where under some conditions, indeed, you are not necessarily have to do like for like offsetting, but you can do it with different species or types of habitat. And I also want to emphasize that biodiversity offsetting is absolutely not new. I mean, in fact, it's been in existence for 40 years in the US. It started in the 80s, then in Canada, then in Australia. And that's great because that gives us a lot of data on it. And in fact, the track record is pretty poor because on average, you have two-thirds of projects failing. So that's really not very encouraging. And of course, it's normal because biodiversity is incredibly more complex than carbon, right? In one case, you have six main greenhouse gases, and in the other, you have millions of species. And it's just simply not possible to translate that into a few types of credit, into a few liquid tradable assets. It's simply not doable. Either you have a large number of credits, of types of credits, like Australia tried in the New South Wales, And then you have no market liquidity because you have too many types of credit. So buyers struggle to find sellers and vice versa. And so the market does not function. Or you have very few types of credits, like a handful. And then, of course, how can you translate the incredible complexity of biodiversity into five types of credits? Well, it's simply not possible. So I mean, because it's not a new idea at all, the environmental integrity issues of biodiversity offsetting have been amply documented in academic literature. We know that it's really difficult. In some cases, we're not able to precisely measure what has been lost and gained. And that's because our knowledge, our scientific knowledge of biodiversity is very incomplete. I mean, we have mapped only 20% of species, I believe. I mean, we have only scratched the surface. And that's problematic because if you want to put a price on species, then the basic pre-requirement is that you know all of them. You are able to assess them because otherwise you may value at zero something that you ignore exists. And that may turn out to play a critical function or critical role in the food chain, for example, or where we would have derived the next generation of antibiotics. So if you're not able to precisely measure what is lost and gained, it's simply very dangerous and wise to try to put a monetary value on it. And we're also not able to, in most cases, to recreate comprehensively all the ecosystemic functions being destroyed. And that's because the science of restoration is very new and it's still in its infancy and it's incredibly complex and costly. The third issue is the one I mentioned earlier, the fact that if you want to have biodiversity offsetting, it requires massive equivalence tables, massive oversimplification and standardization that are simply not possible to combine with environmental integrity. And then let's bear in mind that by definition, even if biodiversity offsetting worked perfectly, it would only at best displace destruction, but not reduce it. So that's not mitigation. That's really not very ambitious as a goal. And also, lastly, we know that the way markets work is that they will try to choose the cheapest and fastest type of restoration option because that's the one that generates the most profit for them. And so, if everybody concentrates on the same type of credits, right? If all the investors want to buy the same type of credit, that means only the same type of restoration projects will be funded. And of course, that's not how nature works, right? You don't need only one type, you need everything. And we already see that, for example, in the UK, where they have a biodiversity net gain market. And investors tend to favor one type of credit called modified grassland. And of course, that's really not really useful from a biodiversity perspective. And then putting a monetary value on biodiversity is also very problematic because it may give the illusion of substitutability, which means that you may, if the global value remains stable, you may think that actually this means that the destruction has stopped, but it may obfuscate the fact that some critical ecosystems are still declining at an alarming rate, whereas other less critical are increasing. So that's really, you kind of look at a very simplified view of the world that may be very detrimental for policy purposes. And so this is all well known. We know that biodiversity offsetting is kind of a no-go from a scientific perspective. But I also want, and also, of course, biodiversity offsetting will generate the same social and human rights concern as with carbon offsets, where it's been amply documented kind of forced evictions and human rights abuse in some cases. And in fact, we already have some cases of scandals with biodiversity credits in Uganda, in Mozambique, in other countries. So that's already happening, and that's not a big surprise. But the point I want to emphasize here today, one of the points I want to emphasize is that even biodiversity credits outside of offsetting are problematic because they introduce a profitability requirement for conservation projects. And these profitability requirements will weaken conservation policies. That means that tomorrow, conservation policies have to be profitable enough to attract private capital. And if and they have to be profitable enough on a consistent basis. Like if they stop being profitable, then investors may stop funding them, and then the related area may see its biodiversity being destroyed because it's no longer protected with irreversible consequences. So that's a first big problem of biodiversity credits. The second big issue is the one I mentioned earlier. You still have this intractable trade-off between requiring oversimplification and standardization to an extreme level in order to have a liquid financial market. And that leads to the risk of a misguided political focus on maximizing oversimplified metrics instead of protecting biodiversity. Because we know how it works, right? Once you have a metric, whether it's GDP, whether it's whatever KPI, then policymakers tend to focus on this metric because that's how you communicate on it. Say, look, I made progress. But if the metric is ridiculously oversimplified, then that's really problematic. Another point that is problematic is that there's a bit of an oversell of the promise of additional funding for conservation through these markets. But in fact, I mean, these markets have been in existence for a long, long time, and they haven't raised significant funding. In fact, I have it on some other slide. Here you see biodiversity offsets attract on average 6 to 9 billion per year globally worldwide, which is really tiny when you put that in perspective with the alleged annual funding gap or with the existing harmful subsidies that could be redirected. And for voluntary biodiversity credit sales in last year, we're talking about $2.9 million. So that's really kind of a joke, I mean, so far. But also, this is not free money. I want to emphasize that this is not free money because if your country enters into these schemes, it will tie up its land use for decades. Whereas it may, so you will lose its national sovereignty and ability to be flexible when, I don't know, if say, imagine in a few years you have food shortages, you have other issues, you want to change your land use and you cannot do it anymore because you're tied with that. And lastly, of course, from a global geopolitical perspective, entering into these schemes arguably will reduces the chance of ever getting international grant payments to protect national biodiversity, even though there is a very valid case for countries that have not destroyed their biodiversity, unlike most of Europe, to be paid by the other countries to not destroy it and forego the related income. So those are the issues of biodiversity credits outside of offsetting. And in the case of Indonesia, the government is working with the IAPB, which is the French and British alliance, international alliance, that works also with the World Economic Forum and some UN agencies. And this IAPB has set up its own framework for so-called high integrity biodiversity credits. But this is really not a sound framework because we've seen this framework and it's high integrity in name only. I mean, amongst the features that contradict its high integrity claims, you have the fact that it allows for offsetting. It includes maintenance credits, basically for not for protecting areas that are not under short-term threat, and therefore there is no real additionality. There is no requirement for permanence, which obviously you want permanence for a protected area, not just for a few years. And they allow also the sale of credits before any positive biodiversity outcome has been measured, which is absolutely not compatible with any high integrity claims. And they also allow for secondary market trading, which is unlimited speculation, which is problematic because that leads to very volatile revenues for anybody involved in this market, from landowners to farmers to, I mean, if you want to fund your national parks with these credits and, well, the price is very volatile, then you don't have the same funding amount from one year to the next. And it can vary from very wildly, which is very problematic. And also the wording regarding the benefit and involvement for indigenous people in local communities is very generic and not very specific. And arguably, from a political perspective, and I'm in Brussels, so I see the lobbying aspect of it, the political aspect of it. The way these markets are being understood is that the main goal is not so much to protect biodiversity, is to allow global north multinational corporations to continue destroying as usual while giving the illusion that their governments are addressing the biodiversity crisis. Or to put it in another language, which is the EU language, is basically the EU, for example, Commission and Western countries in the North are okay to address the biodiversity crisis, but only to the extent that it does not have an adverse impact on their competitiveness and short-term economic growth. So in other words, they don't want to act. It's a really a secondary goal. The goal is just to protect the status quo primarily. And of course, this is kind of what happened with carbon offsets in the past that were both an environmental failure and a political success. And we're at a critical juncture where we cannot afford to just do cosmetics. And this is interesting because the corporate buyers are also seeing all these issues, and that's why they're quite reluctant to buy these credits. I mean, they have seen the Vera scandal in the carbon space. They have seen the Danone scandal with plastic offsets credits in Bali. They have seen the first scandals with biodiversity credits. They also know that there is no robust and sound way to do biodiversity offsetting. And so they know there's a massive reputational risk. And they also know that the funding being raised never was really significant. But also, crucially for them, they have followed what happened in the UK, which is a textbook case of regulatory risk. What happened in the UK is that they launched in early 24 their biodiversity offset market. And then in 25, the government proposed a planning and infrastructure bill that said that you know what? Instead of doing so, in 24, the government said, okay, for real estate developers, if you want to have your building permit from now on, you need to offset all your residual adverse impact on nature. So if you build a new development, then you need to compensate for all the destruction that you made, and even more, you need to have a 10% net gain. Even so, I'm not sure how we can really measure that. So a lot of people got involved into doing restoration projects, etc., and doing that. And then only a mere year later, the government said, well, actually, it's too cumbersome. How about real estate developers just do a one-off payment into restoration fund? And so everybody who had been sold on this market, the farmers who had changed their practices, the landowners were like, hold on a minute. I mean, you're kind of screwing us here. You say we're doing all that for nothing. And so in the end, in the final text, both options are available. But that's a massive weakening, and that's a lesson, that's a cautionary tale on the regulatory risk of this market. What I mean by that is that because these credits have no intrinsic value, right? This is not a real commodity. This is not like wheat. This is not like, I don't know, precious metals. The demand only comes from the government. And if the government changes its mind, then boom, you invested for nothing. And the last point is that the corporate note also that there's no real political interest to make it work in a lot of countries, especially in the global north. It's a bit like the TFFF, the Tropical Forever Forest Facility. They just want to give the appearance that they're doing something, but whether the market actually develops or not, frankly, is not important. The goal is to placate the public opinion, to keep the social license to operate, to destroy as usual. So that's another element. So from all of that, the real solution is not this credit. The real solution, arguably, is to refocus on the core drivers of biodiversity loss. And they're well known. I mean, we have the IUCN, the IPBES, who've written extensively about it. And for example, we know that the main cause of biodiversity loss is deforestation for raising and feeding cattle. And so the real solutions involve, for example, especially in the global north, a change in diets, etc., not creating this pseudo commodity with a very complex financial infrastructure. Having said that, if these markets are ever to be developed, there are some mitigating factors to try and ensure to try and limit the damage. So, amongst other things, for example, they could be combined with a limit on the percentage of conservation funding that can come from these credits in order to ensure that the state is not getting used to rely excessively on a fundamentally unstable source of funding. And we could also take lessons from the carbon space, where you have, for example, in the EU, a cap and trade mechanism. So that's different from the offset market. It's basically you have every year a cap on the biodiversity destruction that is being allowed, and this cap declines a bit every year. So that means that mechanically, if the cap is set at the right level, then destruction will decline progressively. And that's it's very important to have that in conjunction with the credits to ensure that the credits do not become a license to trash. If you look, for example, in the carbon space, right? In the carbon offsetting space, carbon offsets are a license to trash. I mean, arguably, you have big companies like Amazon who buy these carbon offsets to for their massive data centers, etc. And so they will increase their emissions while pretending to act. Same with aviation emissions, right? The companies are buying carbon offsets, but still forecasting a tripling of aviation emissions by 2050 or 2060. So that's clearly the definition of a license to trash. We continue to emit greenhouse gases. We continue, and in fact, we plan to on increasing them. Same with biodiversity destruction, while claiming to act. Well, you don't want that. You want to ensure that if you do discredit, that you're not that. So a cap and trade is a much needed additional mechanism, in my opinion. And then, of course, you do not want to repeat the mistakes of the IAPB framework. So you want an explicit ban on offsetting. You want to make sure that any credit is tied to a project with permanent positive outcomes. You want, of course, to address all the land use issues and recognize indigenous land rights within conservation zone, and not only involvement, but also ideally co-design and fair sharing of returns for indigenous people. You want to ban the ex ante issuance of seller credit because that's really the joke. I mean, if you issue credits without any positive impact, then when the impact materializes or doesn't materialize years later, well, it's too late, right? The credit has been issued, it's been sold, it's been probably retired. I mean, it's too late to do anything about it. So you don't want that. And lastly, you don't, of course, you want to ban secondary market trading, that is the allowance for unlimited speculation. Um, and no, and my last point is the de-risking part, because what we see is that a lot of the proponents of this market in the private sector are pushing the governments to subsidize them. Basically, they want the government to take all the risk and they keep all the profit. And of course, we know that public funding is scarce, and we should not use Indonesian taxpayer money to increase the profits of foreign multinational buyers. That would be a very bad use of the taxpayer money. So I will stop here. To conclude, I would say that, yeah, should Indonesia go ahead with a national biodiversity credit market, it should design it so that it does not become a license to trash nor a gambling casino. And I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Fred. Well, it's quite hard to stomach, isn't it? Fred just giving us like hard fact. So, uh, do we need, should I give like one or two question, or do we want to go to the next one?
I think we
As you,
should just go to the next speaker, and then we will have the whole Q&A session after the two speaker session.
Okay. So hopefully you write your question down, and there's a link as well to if you want to plug in your question now, and we can have more extended time for question and answer. I certainly have quite a few, so let's hold that thought. Next, Masoni, giving like quite a hard task to make this whole like global issue and concept more like at home in our backyard. And I think it's really so. Masoni is my personal advisor in anything related to economics. Whenever I have like, what is this
Thank you.
thing? I just like text Masoni, what does this mean? So just like when we get acquaintance with Fred, and it's so nice that Fred and Masoni actually met in person in Brussels over coffee. I'm so jealous. So this whole idea of this webinar is basically my whole confusions about economics and conservation with Fred and Masoni, and we invite everybody to join in. So I certainly do have a lot of questions, and Masoni, the time is yours. Please do.
Thank you, Wulan. Yeah, it's really great to have also to listen to Fred's presentation today. I have 30 minutes, but I probably spend only half of it just to put some Indonesian context into what Fred has already elaborated and dig deeper. Perhaps before going to the slides that I prepare, a few slides, just for the sake of clarity and those things for the participants here. Fred mentioned interchangeably biodiversity credit, biodiversity offset, these may be two different species or different animals, but yeah, I think Fred meant a bit broader than we've been discussing in Indonesia, because these two expressions, so biodiversity credit, biodiversity offset, is being contested and redefined in Indonesia in terms of policy process. So just to make sure that when I say biodiversity credit, I'm referring to biodiversity credit, which is more into the positive additionality or addition to what we have at the moment, while biodiversity offset is tending towards compensation. You know, you have less somewhere and then you add just to make it balance. So just to make that a bit clearer, yeah. Should I share my slide, or somebody else will share from the? It's up to. I think I can just share it so I have a full control of the slides. Yeah. Okay. So the 1 minute. Give me. Hopefully everyone can see the full slide, the full screen. Just
Yes.
yes. Thank you. So I kind of bingung or have a mixed feeling how to title it. I just, being relevant and consistent with SCB Indonesia's nature finance through biodiversity credit, an Indonesian update. I'm Sonny, and I have to be very, very explicit and frank here, just to make sure that I have no bias, or if I have bias, I will state it, that I'm part of the task force on the biodiversity credit framework or implementation framework that the Ministry of Environment has established. Later, I will sort of share some ideas about the landscape or the scape or seascape or escape, to be fair, in Indonesia about this. I deliberately also put what we did in the past until now, that we mobilize. The Center for Climate Sustainable Finance. We helped the government of Indonesia mobilize 4.8 billion between 2023 and 2024 for forested jurisdiction through the use of forest cover. So this is just to flag to Fred that biodiversity credit, of course, is a thing, but it's only one among others possibilities. And very quiet, the Indonesian government has mobilized domestic resources up to 4.8 billion. This is important to talk about the IPSAP, the Indonesian Biodiversity Plan, which is talking about small amount of money compared to these. The TFFF, we know the post-BLM COP30 kind of hype. It is around only 4 billion, 5 billion, 5.2. So this is supposed to be something, and we need to declare that to allow a wider audience about this. I am also involved, or I was involved with the currency-denominated green bonds, so the early movers, so BNI, Mandiri, Indonesian big banks is oversubscribed. So money are there and it can be mobilized. Then going back to what Fred has mentioned and has very good elaborated, that whether it's a question of money or how we channel it or how we do it, this needs to be part of the conversation. Because biodiversity credit, as I mentioned earlier, and I think Fred will agree on that it's only one among other solutions that is possible. Yeah, I'm working also with the buffer villages, the poor buffer villages surrounding national parks in Sumatra. I have experiences in Papua too, in Sulawesi, in Kalimantan. So I'm a kind of economist that go into the heart of what we call, the biologists call it, the big cats habitat in Rimbang Baling. So I'm not really a kind of economist who, armchair kind of economist. Yeah, I go to the sites. Okay, now let me continue with the next slide. So this is what I call scanning the scape. At the moment, there are two major ongoing initiatives in the public sectors. One is openly or publicly mentioned as innovative financing and national park management. It is under the Ministry of Forestry of the Republic of Indonesia. This is like everywhere, if we will look at the discussion at the moment. It doesn't specify biodiversity credit here, nor biodiversity offset. So it's a bit more, carbon credit and a bit of blending with whatever possible under the umbrella of so-called innovative financing. There's been discussion on, say, how many national parks. 13, to the best of my knowledge. It's a magic number, 13. Whether it's science-based is subject to discussion. I personally love 13, it's a bit spooky and yeah, but we don't know what behind, why 13, why not 12 or 14. We can call it the Indonesian way of science-based kind of numbers, yeah. And we have the biodiversity credit implementation framework, and now increasingly the discussion on the economic value of biodiversity. This is under the Ministry of Environment, which is the UN CBD focal point for the Republic of Indonesia. So it's quite interesting to see this is also emerging as two big initiatives in Indonesia. And we will see interesting things coming out of these policy arenas, schemes, and exercises coming from these in the coming months, in the coming years. So just stay with the development in Indonesia, and I think it will be, personally speaking, will be interesting. In addition to this, there have been also initiatives with the Ministry of the National Development Planning, Bappenas, we call it in Bahasa, which is in charge of the IPSAP, the biodiversity planning policy documents. Now it has included the financing part also on this. I'm also part of the reviewer of the financing exercise. So it's quite interesting also going on with the Ministry of National Development Planning. I'm also aware of the process under the Ministry of Finance launched a month ago on the public finance for biodiversity, and the Ministry of Marine and Fisheries are also talking mostly, under the OECM kind of discussion, also touching on the financing of marine biodiversity initiatives. So in Indonesia, there are different, I'm not so sure whether it's still initiatives, because when it comes to public sector, when it becomes serious, there are already some regulation, ministerial level. Perhaps in the coming years, there will be a government regulation or presidential regulation on these. So it's no longer initiative, but it will be embedded into Indonesian kind of systems and regulation. So what I wanted to say here, there are different initiatives in Indonesia, there are different explorations tending toward embedding it into the Indonesian system and policies. So when we are talking about biodiversity credit, I know Fred has written a critical letter commenting, responding to these initiatives. I think it reflects to one of these, and bringing the IAPB also. IAPB in Indonesia has been quite engaging with all of these initiatives, so it's not related to one specific of these. So that's why I think my appeal here to have a better and clearer idea about which attribution should we, attach to which initiative when it comes to, for example, IAPB. Now let me move to my next slide. This has nothing to do with the task force. This is my sort of my concern as I prepare the slide today. So what I see, the current state, the current condition in Indonesia is the main framework narrative at the moment is underfunding. I know Fred is not necessarily agreeing with this. I mean, we can mobilize from somewhere else. I personally, I have shown we can mobilize 4 billion for our domestic resource mobilization. It's up and running in Indonesia at the moment. The Bank of Papua, for example, involved in what we call funding, syndicates, financing the LRT, the light rail trail in Jakarta, cosmopolitan area. So the bank, the Subnational Development Bank of Papua, is funding Jakartan people transport. So, and at the same time saying, oh, we do not have funding. So funding is a thing, that can also be mobilized depending on the decision. So the discussion on underfunding, overfunding, we need to be put into context. But we have to admit the narrative behind biodiversity credit, innovative financing in Indonesia, what have you, is under the narrative of underfunding. Okay, so we take it there. Now, at the same time, we do not have optimal biodiversity conservation. We know it, right? The whatever measure we have, we still have a problem. I put relatively here because in Indonesia, the large areas are under public control, the public ownership, the state. Forests are and marine are largely forest owned. So there's a limited access. There have been discussion that because of this limited access, we still relatively have we can debate about this, but there is certain state of biodiversity conservation. Now we need to point this because the idea being entertained at the moment is open access to this very, the heart of national park. Okay, like it's a simple word of saying liberalizing Indonesian forests. Okay, where I know, Fred, this is, so you can already see the shift of the narrative at the moment. But despite what we have at the moment in Indonesia, the limited access, that should be the Rona Awal. That should be the baseline at the moment. The current state is under funding and relatively not optimal biodiversity conservation. Now, what we need to avoid, or we need to anticipate what might have happened in the future as what I call the future state. It may remain underfunded in the future, given innovative finance, given biodiversity credit, given biodiversity offset, all the set of these, we still will be underfunded. Because if we look at the need, the possibility of mobilizing it, be it public, private, blending, the possibility of underfunding is still large, still high. Okay, so it may remain underfunded. And because of the open access, we need to debate and discuss very seriously, very honest, about the optimal biodiversity conservation. I mean, science showed different, there has been synthesis on this about, the public funding, the private funding, the community, this common pool resource kind of things with this. So I want to make it or suggest these here just for all of us, especially the SCB, Society for Conservation Biology Indonesia chapter, need to be clear of these because we have biologists here, we have economists, we have biologists who, really love economists, but the neoclassical one, not the heterodox one. So I'm kind of, in Indonesia, we call deg-degan. I don't know how to say it in English, Mbak Wulan, deg-degan. You speak English better than I
Anxious.
do. Anxious, yes. I'm kind of anxious when I talk to biologists about these. I mean, they really embrace market instrument wholeheartedly, while economists has reservations. So I mean, they fall in love with these. We can, when someone fall in love, the rest just we call it cost. We just kosan. The world belongs to those who fall in love. But let me mention about the possibility of a future state. We remain underfunded, may remain underfunded, but the conservation side may be less optimal than what we have now. So if this is the possible case, then we need to think if we accept biodiversity finance, if we accept biodiversity credit, if we accept biodiversity offset, we can debate with Fred, of course. Fred represents the most, very critical about this. I'm kind of stuck in between. We need to make everybody's happy with this. But I kind of understand the aspiration of Indonesia, given the existing modalities, carbon credit, RED Plus. We have all these modalities in Indonesia in the past 10, 15 years with all the the bruises, the cuts in Indonesia, people fighting each other. We learn a lot about this, the negative, the positive. So I want to bring that modalities into this discussion and moving a bit from Fred's side, moving a bit less, or moving into more accommodating of possibilities also in Indonesian context. So now to the last slides. This is a few thoughts that I think we should consider and craft in terms of policies. So I'm kind of shifting from the science, from the economic side, from the biology, the conservation biology into the policy side. Now, the first one is we do not have the silver bullet here, okay? Never hallucinate with this. We have only one solution and it will, solve everything, okay? Be critical to whoever propose silver bullet, be it carbon credit, carbon offset, biodiversity credit, or innovative finance. No. I think what we need to think about is the possibility of having policy mixes, right? There are differences of policy schemes, instruments, tools that are possible. So here, what science needs to do is to understand the what we call the synthesis effects and the trade-off effects when these all instrument, tools, schemes are putting together. Science need to contribute to understand this, right? Because it can be adding, it can be, negating. Those are possible. And we need to mobilize science and scientists to understand this better. But there is no silver bullet in this. So we need to embrace what is possible here. When we talk about biodiversity credit, we need to talk about public finance mobilization, because biodiversity conservation needs a huge amount of money. I'm talking of a money mobilized, for war, to attack Iran, to attack Iraq, to attack, whatever. There's a lot of money, okay? If we talk about biodiversity, that kind of scale of money we need to mobilize. We cannot say we can attack other countries, but we cannot support, global South countries. This is not the kind of we want to have. In Indonesia, and Indonesia is stuck in between of above middle income and below middle income. So it's kind of interesting with Indonesia, we cannot, what I call Instagram dilemma, I want to post something nice in my Instagram account because I just visited Europe, for example, but I know I'm just a researcher, a poor researcher, right? When the tax office knock my door, I can suddenly become very poor. But my Instagram show I can be very, very rich. So Indonesia stuck in between of this, want to show rich, but is also poor, right? Indonesia want to show leadership by mobilizing funding, TFFF, the domestic mobilization. But, it needs to do the stunting thing with MBG, the global South kind of typical issues. Now, so we need to have a public funding and then blend it with private finance later on. We need to discuss, I think Fred is best well positioned to talk about this, but my point is we need to be a bit skeptical with private finance at the moment because they are not coming to Indonesia despite the hypes. I'm still waiting at the moment, where are these funding at the moment? I mean, the public funding is there. I mentioned 4.8 billion. There, very concrete, up and running in Indonesian system. The private finance, any new research show it's less than the ambition. It keeps coming with some evidence. So we need to treat these as possibilities, and we need to bring every source of funding together. Okay, now clear intended outcomes. What are we going to aim? Mobilizing findings or bending biodiversity loss curve, and so on and so forth. This is important because we can easily slip into discussion on finance and lose the larger perspective of what are we going to do here or what are we doing here. We want to save some flagship species. We want to bring wealth to societies, communities who are, this flagship dependent or national park dependent kind of environment or context. And these are need to be in the conversations. Because if we do not have a clear intended outcomes and metrics and so on, then we can easily, talk about money, but it's not really going into what we intend to have. Okay, the next one is meaningfully crowding in finance. So when we have public finance, okay, and when I talk public finance, it can be from the Indonesian side, it can be from the global north side. I mean, UK need to mobilize its public funding. Norway, US, forget US at the moment, Germany, they need to mobilize their public funding, provide it to the global south. And then these public funding, can crowd in private finance. But private finance coming in with this public funding is to enhance the possibility of having more, outcomes for biodiversity and nature. Not that it is taking the public funding resources. That may also happen, and again, Fred probably knows better about that possibilities. I don't know that better, but I think we need to avoid the possibilities of that. That's why we need to talk about later on caps, adjustment, and specific instruments vis-a-vis what we have in Indonesia. Okay, the final one, participation and leadership. In Indonesia, there's an interesting emerging discussion at the moment where innovative funding or biodiversity credit or finance can also go into the heart of the nature, the national park or biodiversity conservation sites. This is not happening in the past, and it is now being introduced at the moment. Now, some of the forest-dependent societies, they have been waiting for this. They cannot enter, right, these sites. Now they see other can enter these sites. Now they are asking the possibilities, can we also enter the heart of the national park? This is not settled at the moment, but I think there is a good opportunity for us to talk about the possibility of having more participation, meaningful participation, co-creating, co-designing, even co-leading this process. Not only, indigenous communities are invited to meetings about biodiversity credit, for example, but I think learning from REDD+, for example, when Indonesia introduced in the beginning, there has been, indigenous communities opposed in the beginning, but later on they appreciate the possibilities. They have the possibilities of having carbon credit, but they don't have to sell it. By having the possibility of carbon credit, then they can have, have a fixed and secure land tenure. They can talk about their own maps. They can have access to their own rights. So these are benefits that are possible because we talk about carbon credit. Okay, they don't have to sell it. So what we are talking here, we can also think about this in Indonesia, that we can be critical to biodiversity credit, but we open the possibilities that there are also good things possible from the biodiversity credits. When, for example, indigenous communities, they join this, they co-leading it, and their rights are acknowledged here. The decision to sell it, to participate in which schemes, we let them, do it. This is their kind of thing. So this kind of discussion that I miss to be part of the conversation at the moment. And by saying this, I'm offering to Fred, to other colleagues, those participating in this, there may be some possibilities, somewhere a sweet spot between the extremes of what we criticize and what we see as possible. I think I have come to the very slide, and yeah, I hope it's less than 30 minutes. Thank you, Mbak Bulan.
Thank you so much, Masoni. Thanks, Fred and Masoni. But one thing that really intrigued me, that biologists fall in love with this concept. I guess, like, talking as a biologist myself, I'm just like, well, I couldn't speak for everybody, but the first time I become a biologist, just because, oh, I love animals, I want to be near them, I want to go, like, I want to see all of the big cats of the world. That's basically it. And that's not enough money. And there's this promise of this big money coming. like TFFF, $125 billion. They said, oh, it sounds like a good idea. But then again, coming from naivety of of a biologist, and it's not our field. But the fact that like people coming and trying to invest, oh, I have $500,000, where can I invest in Kalimantan for a carbon project? I was like, oh, what's going on? So thank you so much for this for the time, and I'm basically just talking from my side, but hopefully it's like mirroring with what everybody feel in this forum. But as a moderator, I have the privilege to asking the first questions. So I'm just gonna summarize as much as I can. So in terms of like natural finance, there's a lot of mechanisms. Obviously, there's a bond, there's a carbon, there's a credits, there's a BNG and all of that, and there's offset, obviously. But is it correct if I summarize that the whole issue, whether like it's a local or global, of this, like specifically on natural finance credit, is the issue of compliance. The regulatory dilemma in Indonesia is separated into like two different ministry at least, and like different scheme and different perspective. And then the scale problem of it, obviously the fungibility, how could you create a unit, how fungible it is to reduce all biodiversity into one single unit that you can trade, and the complexity of doing that. And the rest is the last one is about like the measurement of it, like how do you verify that this credit that you buy is actually like serving the what is intended to, not just displacing the distractions. And I also wanna comment on that. So like aside from serving as the Society for Conservation Biology Asia Board, my day job is a funder, as a philanthropist, working for this philanthropy in New York that giving money for Great Apes and given the Arcus Foundation. And I am in that room in every like climate week in London and New York. I'm in that room with the other funders talking about the FFF, talking about giving access more to like the indigenous people and local community and the African descent to access to this money. And it's always puzzled me, like people say, humans, we contain multitudes, we hold complexity, but it's only so much that you can hold that, without giving you, how does this make sense? Talking about a lot of this money and the gap of what is needed and what we actually have, even with TFFF, is only, if it's successful, it's only 125 billions compared to what we need. And talking about like access to the indigenous people, it's promised like 20% of it's going directly to the IPLC. But then we go to the details. Obviously, the TFFF's how how ambitious would that be? It's like it's coined in the last COP in Latin America. But then when you try to apply it, even for us, Masoni, who are the indigenous people, right? And like that definition is really matters when you talk about a billion that people that can have access to this funding. If we're talking about like direct financing, the Latin America. So there's like usually three big territories when we talk about IPLC: the Congo Basin in Africa, the Amazonians, all of Latin America, and us, the Indonesia, usually in all of Asia. And just the definition, who are the indigenous people, is really like quite straightforward in Amazon, I think, countries. And in Africa, it's not so much as well. That's why we add like African descent definitions in there. But in Asia, it's quite complicated. Who are the indigenous people? I'm a Sundanese. I think I'm indigenous people. Like, can I have access to the money? Apparently not, because it's quite complex as well to define that. With all of this, with this big initiative, big money involved relatively to what we usually have in nature conservations, the issue of that regulations, definitions really matters. And I think that's where we as a conservation biologists usually get lost with all of this promise. We see the numbers, but what does that entails? What does that means? And like you mentioned, Masoni, a lot of this carbon project and biodiversity project is in the area that we call APL. Fred, is area penggunaan. What is it called again? Area penggunaan lainnya, is it? Forget.
Yes, yeah.
So it's like non-forest, like legally non-forest, even though there's still like forest from like ecological standpoint. But it's really interesting that Masoni, you mentioned that liberalization of Indonesia forests with the inclusion of the 30 national park within the scheme. So I think that's what I think. There's so many concepts, so many issues all like intertwined. How is the regulation? How is actually is implemented in Indonesia, and all of this like big promise with billions of dollars and money, and the fact that most of it, like quite a lot of it, like hinge on like public money, which is like tax people money. But like the people that making money, like how we unlock that private funding at the other side of the economics. And also like what we mentioned, there's a lot of money going on in this world. It's mostly for war, like the cost of one of the uh, I don't know what call it, drones or whatever. But how could we reverse that harmful subsidy, Fred, like we chat about, like to the other way around, to the one that actually saving the nature and the biodiversity, and at the end of the equations actually saving us as a humans. I don't really have a question for now. It's just like wonder if what I got is if there's anything like clearly wrong from what I said, and we can like open for question if you don't have any other comments. Fred.
Can I just comment briefly
Yes.
on what Sonny said earlier, if I
Yeah.
may? I mean, I find it really interesting, and I want to I'm asking myself a few questions, and I'd love to have your take on that. The first thing is you rightly said, it's like a war, and the reality, I mean, we know that the biodiversity crisis is a national security crisis, is a health crisis, is a food security crisis. It's all at once. And we know also that when governments face a war, suddenly they find all the public funding that is needed, right? And they would not think of funding a war with private credits based on some financial market. So why isn't, I think there should be the same urgency and sense of priority. So that's the first thing. In the UK, I don't know if you've seen the Joint Intelligence Committee report that said that they expect food shortages within 5 years. We're not talking about a nice to have. We're talking about a national emergency. So this should be treated and funded as wars are, right? Not so that's my first point. And then, yeah, the funding narrative, the funding gap narrative is arguably debatable. I mean, I'm not talking here in the Indonesian context, but globally, right? So if you look at this narrative, it says that essentially the reason why we have a biodiversity crisis is because there is a funding gap. That's the main reason to fund conservation. That this funding gap is estimated around 700 billion annually is far too big for governments to possibly fund it themselves. And so we should rely on private capital. And the best way to do that is to create biodiversity credit markets, right? So that's the narrative. But if you look at it line by line, you see that it's a politically biased narrative. It's not a self-evident one, right? First of all, the funding gap is one element amongst many, but it's not by far the main reason of biodiversity destruction. The main reason, we know the main causes is overfishing, destruction of forests, etc. So it's some other activities which could be addressed through tighter environmental regulation, which by themselves do not cost anything. That's one thing. But let's say, okay. And secondly, as for the idea that governments are not globally able to fund it with public money alone, well, the UN tells us that there is currently 1,700 billion of annual subsidies to harmful activities. That is much more than the funding gap. So if the government stopped subsidizing destruction massively, they could very easily close the funding gap with public money, without raising taxes, without increasing public deficit. So what that means is that there is absolutely zero need for private capital. It's a political choice. We can choose to continue to subsidize destruction massively and ask for private capital, but that's a political choice. It's not a necessity. That's what I'm getting at. And then let's assume that the government decides, all right, I still want to just continue subsidizing destruction massively. So subsidizing mining, subsidizing agro-food business, subsidizing real estate and infrastructure. And I want to use private capital, right? Well, I mean, the best way to shift private capital and the fastest way is arguably through, again, environmental regulation. Why? Because any regulation, by definition, will impact the future expected profits of the activities being regulated. And the private capital flows will adjust mechanically to the new profit expectations. So that would be far easier and simpler. But okay, again, political choice. We want to use only the carrot and not the stick, right? We think that regulation is too coercive. So we want only to use economic incentives to private capital and not regulation. But again, here, arguably, if you want to shift private capital, it would be so much easier, simpler to do it via tax incentives or regulatory incentives rather than creating a whole new market on a pseudo commodity, which is very complicated. What I'm getting at and talking explicitly about biodiversity credits here is that this is arguably the last solution, the most complicated one, if the goal is purely to protect biodiversity. And so that's the thing. And in fact, what we see I can speak for the countries that I know very well, like the UK, etc. The goal is never to protect biodiversity alone. It's a double goal, right? There's an economic goal of building new homes, of making GDP and protecting biodiversity. So that's what I'm getting at. And the last 2 points is that I agree with Sony, it's not a silver bullet, but more than that, my fear is that what I've witnessed time and again with carbon and in other of these instruments is that it doesn't come in addition to other policy tools. Very often, and despite all the safeguards, it is used instead of, right? I see the lobbyists using this instrument to say, look, now we have this market, there's no more need to regulate, there's no money for public funding, etc. And so it kind of undermines the other policy tools. So that's my fear. That's my main concern. And I want to finish with a very positive example. There was a landmark study last year from the Lancet Commission, who looked at the biodiversity crisis and said, look, if we were to do one thing globally to address the biodiversity crisis, that would be to cut food waste and change diets globally, right? Because the main reason of the biodiversity crisis is deforestation to raise and feed cattle, right? And if we were to change slightly diets, I mean, for those who eat meat too frequently, like eat less meat less frequently, then we would address a lot of the deforestation. We would curb greenhouse gas emission, and we'd also curb water pollution from overuse of pesticides. And what is really interesting is they came up with a recommended diet, and it's not even extreme, right? Their recommended diet was, all right, you can eat beef once a week, you can eat chicken twice a week, you can eat fish twice a week, and you can eat 3-4 eggs a week. And the rest is veggies, beans, etc. And so you're like, well, okay, surely, that's manageable. And if we do that, most of the issue is being addressed. And how do we get there politically? Well, they say, again, they provide some cues. They say, look, you just ban advertising for meat, for example. You just ban and you tax unhealthy food more and you subsidize healthy food. And in fact, Amsterdam in the Netherlands just did that. They just ban advertising for meat. So my point is that I find it hard to reconcile this whole very complicated financial market thingy with addressing the root causes in a concrete way like this is. And so that's the point. And I know that also you talked about fungibility earlier, right, Willan? And we know that the IAPB and others are talking about national markets to address for the local specificities, but there will be linkages between different markets, so there will be equivalences, etc. So I fear that we will have these issues. Nevertheless, where EU companies, it's already seen in the EU context, the EU Commission is already saying, all right, the EU companies will be able to continue, for example, to destroy nature in Indonesia for their business and buy biodiversity credits in Indonesia. And then it's fine. Everything is fine. It's good for EU competitiveness. So those are my concerns, and I will shut up.
Thank you, Fred. Well, should I respond to this, or do we continue?
Yes. Yes, we have a few questions, but I think we will still have time for that.
Okay, so just very short on this. Yeah, I find it interesting, the expression of politically biased. It's a bit elusive in the sense that everything is biased politically, right? I mean, under the sun is politically biased. My observation would be I mean, the cost for biodiversity conservation at the moment is not really, having a political weight in Indonesia. So we have to accept, unfortunately, that the way the discussion on biodiversity conservation in Indonesia will be biased toward those who are not really into this, right? So that's something that we need to at least accept it first, and then when we want to propose something innovative, it will be operating in these possibilities. I mean, we cannot, for example, Indonesia have carbon tax at the low level. That is the constitution of Indonesia, Undang-Undang Harmonisasi Perpajakan, right? But until now, we do not even have yet the roadmap for carbon tax. Even it is already mandated by a law, and I'm talking of a law. It's not regulation, it's not decree, it's a law. And then that by saying that also puts a limit on approaching in Indonesia through these, law regulations. But I can also come up with other things with, kind of lower level regulation that can mobilize a very huge amount of money, just like the 4.8 billion I mentioned. So we need to understand this context, regulatory speaking, and so on, to put these things into, politically biased or not, and it depends on whose interest we are serving here. But I kind of see biodiversity credit or any finance discussion on these is also related to how the political, constellation and contest defining what we can have in Indonesia at the moment. Now, the biodiversity credit or innovative financing at the moment, the discussion, I think is quite interesting because there are different possibilities trying to enter the sphere in Indonesia. I think what we need to do is to, bring more science in this, but also show, the limitation of each of these, when they're being talked about or being discussed about. Because at the moment, the science part is not so much part of the conversation in Indonesia. And at the same time, the political side, they can mobilize very big things, huge things, because of their preference. And preference can be for political gain, votes, next electoral cycle, or it can also be because of personally driven things, like I want to have legacies, right? In Indonesia, probably the story, Indonesia can have the food program mobilizing a lot of money, like cutting, whether we agree or disagree with it. This is another class of discussion with MBG, but it mobilized a lot of money. I can imagine what happened if President Prabowo can mobilize these for biodiversity or climate, right? Maybe it's not in his or a political hat at the moment. Now, that's part of a challenge. I think what we need and what we need to talk about is bringing biodiversity and climate into Indonesian security issues. I'm thinking something along this line. I no longer believe when I talk about climate in terms of carbon, even the incentive kind of things. But we may want to explore the possibility of talking climate change, sea level rise, Indonesian border will be changing, Indonesian, national integrity will be compromised. That will ring more bell than saying the incentive from this, right? And then people will take it very serious. It's a security issue for Indonesia. Sea level rise induced by climate change. And then as the largest, archipelago state in the world, it's going to be an issue. So we no longer talk about Indonesian Hormuz, the Selat Malaka thing. We talk about climate, vulnerability because of our border integrity, because of sea level rise. Now we need to find things along this line for biodiversity. We love elephants, big cats, but what happens to Indonesia, it doesn't really connect at the moment compared to say, for security reasons. So can our dear biological conservationists think about something that really ring, to Prabowo and his team about this, security issues. What happens to Suharto can mobilize soldiers to make sure that elephants can go through the pathway, right? The regular pathway. I heard stories that Suharto even cried for this. Can we think about possibilities of really capitalizing on these? I'm talking of Suharto, right? Not even Prabowo. They cried because of elephants. Of course, they're also chopping down our forests, right? But these are human nature. These possibilities are there. But I think maybe we need to explore these possibilities. That makes climate or biodiversity in this very sense something that they take it very serious, right? Rather than, with all due respect to incentives, as Fred mentioned, there are other easier way to mobilize money than these more difficult, not so sure kind of schemes, right? That biologists becoming, in love with. Yeah, that's again, I tell it many times, but I'm sending flags. We need to talk about critical about this, but also appreciate the possibility that it may also be possible for Indonesia. I hope I addressed some of these, Fred. With regulation, in Indonesia, every afternoon we can issue regulation, Fred. Don't worry about that. Yeah. Whether it is implemented, that's another discussion. Yeah, that's why be careful with regulation in Indonesia. And NGOs love, box ticking for, advocating for regulation for this, for that. But too many regulation in Indonesia. We are confused, and we need even to have like omnibus kind of, because it's just too too messy. Yeah.
Yeah. In Indonesia, regulation doesn't come with the compliance.
Ah,
It's that one
I'm
packet.
telling Indonesia, but I can confidently say also it happens in Brussels, Fred. So you are not on the safe side. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Masoni. Yes, yes. It's all about interest, isn't it? Like political will and all of that. Well, we all can do everything as long as we put our mind into it. And if we have the power, we can do so much more. And what you mentioned, Mason, is also like, it's mirroring what happened in the world, basically, right? There's a lot of money to be made aside from this, like really, really big pledges in the COP that we make like every so for other years. There's a lot of more money that's like away from that, like, blitz and the big press come into it. But it's not sexy. It's not giving them like the platform that politicians usually crave, and just the complexity of regulation. Not a lot of people are willing to get into it, and for like people like just everyday people, what can we do? And the paper that you mentioned, Fred, it's really doable. Like that's what we need a lot more people. Like people said, like, we need more people do things imperfectly, but like everybody doing it instead of like just few people doing perfectly. Just changing your diet, like everybody knows that not everybody want to be a vegetarian, understandably, but like reducing your meat, that's kind of thing that we can do. And I think as a biologist as well, like, getting, older and older, like I used to be like, wide eyes, like 19 years old something, going to the Waikambas to see the elephant and the rhinos. But, Masoni, why like biologists become like more and more, what do you call it? Uh, Not pessimistic, but like realist, because we see like the world that like, people like me, at least we see like the nature and the world that we love just disappearing in front of our eyes, and it's so hard to communicate that obviously to the people that doesn't really give a thing about the elephant or the reef, like the fishes in the ocean and the coral reefs that getting destroyed by the what do you call it again, the white bleach and all of that. So I think there's a grief that we couldn't communicate, and it's not transferring easily in regulations. And every time there's a hope that these things can be solved by these new pledges in the COP, like billions of dollars. People are like, oh, it might mean something, but what is it actually? So that's exactly what this talk is about. So, and I write like a lot of things that I learned from Fred and Masoni from like a global perspective and also from Indonesian perspective. And I think it's time for us to share the time with the audience. I have five questions here. I think I'm gonna choose. And there's also like one that connect directly to your comment, Masonia, about like, you know, the loss of biodiversity and the security issue. Can we frame it in a zoonotic disease and food security? I mean, it is happening now. Like we have the pandemic, we feel the repercussion of that economic wise, but you know, certainly it's quite good for nature at that time, that lockdown time. And for food security, with you know, with the war, like we are kind of like beginning of the World War III, and you know, the supply of like just the fertilizations all around the world, we facing that food security, it is there as well. I'm just combining a lot of like questions now. There's few quite like very practical questions in the link. So I'm going to combine these two questions. So that was like there's one in terms of like security, and it's another question is what minimum standards of transparency and independent verifications should restoration projects meet to receive biodiversity finance? And just combine it with this one. And how do you see like global sustainability standards such as like RSPO and FSC contribute to the credibility and implementation of biodiversity credits? I think that's speak to that compliance side of the market.
Yeah, so there are a number of questions. Fred, want to respond first, or?
Go ahead.
Okay, yeah. In Indonesia, we usually give the opportunity to the older one, Fred. Yeah.
I thought I'm the oldest.
No, it's getting more serious. It's so quiet. It's the first time SCB very quiet. Yeah. Okay. When it comes to the, I think someone wrote the zoonotic. I think it's one of the best candidate for making sense of the biodiversity, right? Of course, we know the difficulties of bringing a zoonotic, you know, in the science part into the discussion on the urgency and why we need to tackle biodiversity issue here. But I think society appreciate that. Like we had experience with COVID, and some others may also come in the future. But I don't know, and maybe we need to consult with psychologists in terms of, you know, how can it really trigger and then, you know, bring people or mobilize and move or galvanize people to really into biodiversity. I mean, it's quite interesting in Indonesia, but also in other places where when we plan without disaster, it didn't really work. And it seems that we need disaster first to really plan. That's a bit sad, but it happens everywhere. And I think that's human nature, right? So if we can think about, you know, bringing a zoonotic disease in case of biodiversity, or I think there have been some efforts to bring reduced income because of the change of ecosystem services or nature contribution to people, because of ecosystem changes, you know, biodiversity reduce and so on, then it affects income and wage of the community. So these kind of things that we need to talk about more, so people see directly the connection of keeping biodiversity and ecosystem to their own, you know, benefits. But whether that's on a par with, say, a security issue because of sea level rise, I don't know at the moment in terms of how policymakers, the government will take it very serious. Because in Indonesia, whatever security thing is, you know, it can easily become very, very serious things, right? And that's the thing that at the moment I don't know how to really frame a biodiversity here, unless maybe we bring the flagship species into Indonesia is elephant, Indonesia is tiger. I don't know, at the moment we do not really have that, right? I mean, I can imagine Thailand and elephant, Indonesia and elephant, yes, Waikambas or Lampung to some extent, yes, but not Indonesia with elephant, right? correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't really see this equivalent narrative. So it's at the moment it's a bit difficult to bring these, biodiversity flagship kind of things, species into the best interest of Indonesia. So that's I think we need to think together about bringing these as a collective effort. Other question? What else, Mbak Bulan? Sorry, the standard.
So, yes.
Yeah, standards is a bit tricky here, and I don't know how to comment on this because of possible multiple entry points to comment on this. In Indonesia, we have like an equivalent coexisting standards alongside the international one. I mean, we can have it RSPO in palm oil, but we can also in other areas, right? I think why we have this Indonesian version of standards, and I think it can also happen later on with biodiversity verification kind of standard thing, because the international one is a bit too expensive, for example, data need to be submitted there and so on. So these enough reason to have Indonesian version. But I think there are more reasons why Indonesia also would like to have its own versions. I think, in my humble opinion, it's also because of the interest that Indonesia want to preserve. Why it come up with different standards, right? And if I may comment on this, I think it's okay to have different standards. Standards will be adhered to when it is really credible or viable for any parties involved in this. So if we have Indonesian standards that are credible to others, they may also fly. And then the other way around, right? If international standard, then it doesn't really, not really bought in by all the parties, then it will not also fly. So that's why I think we need to discuss a bit more specific into which standards are we talking about. But when it comes to biodiversity, with all due respects, at the moment the standards are still more expensive. I know some of the participants are working on some of the initiative for biodiversity credits and offsets. Yeah, in the end, the project documents, I think you will be requested to submit some data, and that's the area where some of the project, developer will say, maybe we think about this, those kind of things. Yeah. But my point is, I mean, when it comes to the Indonesian position, I think we need to be aware also that Indonesia has its own policy preferences, right? And that's why Indonesian standards is also representing this, whether we like it or not. And this is okay in any areas. I mean, we know the European standards, right, represent the European interests. This just human nature, policies are just human representation and so on. But I think despite this competition, this contest, we need to think the broader, the bigger picture, climate stabilization, 1.5, 2 degrees, right? Biodiversity, bending the curve. I mean, this is irrelevant of which country are we coming from, right? This is the global planetary system, right? So this kind of bigger picture we need to have, which is not a good moment at the time because every countries are going exactly diametrically opposed to this interest, the global one. So yeah, that's what I can comment, but I'm not really sure whether it's feasible at the moment. Yeah. Maybe after Trump, I don't know.
To complement what Sonny just said, I mean, I'm not an expert on these scandals. I know that the FSC is quite controversial. I mean, there's been quite a lot of accusation of greenwashing from Greenpeace and others. But on the transparency thing and third-party verification, I mean, again, I don't know. I mean, I come from financial markets and I come from the policy side, and transparency is necessary, is indispensable, but is not sufficient in my experience. I mean, in policy, if you don't want to act on something, you ask for disclosure requirement because that's the weakest policy tool. I mean, in Brussels, right? It's a less binding thing. I mean, it's kind of cheap. Either you try to, so transparency is not really a high bar, a high standard. So yes, transparency is important, but I don't think it's sufficient.
Thank you. Thanks, Fred. And I mean, like all of this, like the standard verification is like assuming that fungibility issue of the biodiversity, obviously it's solved, right? That's still a big issue based on my limited knowledge. What you can say the unit of biodiversity, is it bond or cadets, is different. It depends on like which third party are you working with. There's also that question, really a little practical on measuring biodiversity offsetting credits. I think whoever asking that question, we're going to save that question for the next one. We're going to have another discussion on practicality and how people actually use it in Indonesia next month. Nabila will come with the information later. So we're going to save that question. Thank you so much for the questions. Another one about compliance. I think this is interesting. How can carbon credit markets evolve from a compliance mechanisms into an economic engine that stimulates both scalable green business model innovations and safeguard biodiversity impact?
It's an interesting question. I mean, again, it depends on how you understand, I mean, carbon offsets, right? Historically, carbon offsets were never meant as as a tool to increase environmental ambitions. They were a flexibility mechanism, if you recall. So the goal was to make it cheaper for companies to comply and for governments to make it easier for governments to achieve their goals. And so, if you understand it this way, there was never any political will to make carbon credits better because that would defeat the purpose. The goal is to, I mean, they're here because they're a cheaper alternative to anything that works better, even though they don't really. And so, if you try to address their fundamental design issues, then you make it more expensive and they lose political appeal. I mean, if you look at what happened, for example, after the Vera scandal, right? The massive scandal where Vera is the main certification company in the world. And it was found that 94% of the credits they issued are greenwashing, are hot air, right? Well, I mean, there's been a lot of rhetoric, a lot of talk about addressing the issues in the framework and going for high integrity. And in fact, if you look at the measures that have been taken, there's been some improvement, but it's not a massive improvement. So I think carbon credits will still suffer from a bad reputation, and deservedly so. And so I don't see them becoming a massive growth engine. The only thing that goes into this direction, unfortunately, I would say, is that you have all these big AI companies now that are buying more credits for their data centers to try and greenwash the impact. But that's not a positive development. That's the only massive development I see. You have Amazon and the others who are buying a lot of these credits. But that's the only driver of growth through these credits that I see, and I don't think it's a positive one.
Any comment, Sonny?
Okay. So now my response to this question, very good question, is again, excuse me, Fred, I'll move a bit from Fred into something that is more positive and more possible in terms of Indonesian context. So I think we can have a better carbon market in Indonesia, in Indonesian context, through what I call the policy mix, as I raised in my presentation earlier. And what I meant by this is Indonesia can have carbon market or carbon, even we have a carbon, how do you call it, bursa carbon at the moment. I'm speaking of derivative like forward and so on in Indonesia now already has. These schemes will at least work as anticipated if, in my opinion, at the same time we induce the demand for this through carbon tax. So as long as Indonesia doesn't have a serious carbon tax, then the carbon market will not fly. I mean, in Indonesia, we have the market, it looks like, how to say it in English, kuburan, like a cemetery, right? No one is really trading. It's very sepi. It's very, how do you call it? Yeah, a cemetery, right? like it's not really taking place, the activities, right? But when we have, in my view, if we have carbon tax, applied in Indonesia, I think they will see, okay, rather than paying higher tax, I will just buy credits, right? At the moment, people can just leha-leha, right? Just no, we don't buy credits, there is no consequence on this. But the government may want to consider making carbon tax. It has already the law for this, I mentioned. Just, finalize the roadmap and put it in place. And it will induce demand for carbon credits. Suddenly become a flourishing, I believe it will be a flourishing market in Indonesia. At the moment, again, with all due respect, it looks like a cemetery, right? Indonesian carbon market. So it's a simple possibilities, I think, if we think the whole, bigger picture through what I call policy mix, right? We have carbon tax in place, carbon market in place, and, all good things will be added to that. Segala hal baik will be akan ditambahkan, so to say. But if we do not have that carbon tax, we shy away from this. Yeah, we cannot blame why this is so, the market, the kind of market we have is so, not really what we expect. Yeah.
I have two follow-up questions. One, Masone, it's all like very good and profitable and it's going to bring all of the good things for us, why don't the government implement it? What is the main stumbling block for that? The second question is for Fred. Like, yeah, I read that paper 2023, isn't it? Like the scandal for like FERA and all of the issue with the carbon offset, carbon credit. But my question is, like, I chat with Julia Jones as well, one of the co-author of the paper. Like, should we, like, if it's like that bad, like, should we like throw it all together? But isn't that going to be the risk? You throw the baby out with the bathwater, or should we like you still have some merits in any way where we just need to like strengthen it, like making sure there's no over issued of the credits, making sure there's no leakage and all of that. The issue that they have now, is it the issue that feasible to be fixed? So Masoni, I think you can go first.
Okay. So me first, and this is a difficult question, and it is recorded and it's open public, so somebody will hate me probably.
No, we can censor
But
it. I think Nabila can do
but
that.
I think this is my take, and I refer back to what I said earlier. When Fred mentioned about politically biased, and this is the political economic side of this. When you mention if it is that good, why not? For me, it's really good because I look from the environmental economics or ecological economic side of things. But why it's not happening? That's the political economy of this. I can imagine why it's difficult or a bit challenging in Indonesia because of the political economy of this. Our industry is really fossil fuel. Our economy is really high carbon. So I can imagine how difficult it is, and there will be efforts to prevent that from happening because our economy is really embedded into the fossil fuel structure, right? And when we introduce carbon tax for forest fire, inducing concessions or um, coal-fired power plants, we can already see how difficult it will be in Indonesia because it's really into the core, the heart of Indonesian economy, right? So that's why I don't know at the moment. That's why in the beginning I said, even if it is nice and cool, but in terms of political economy, it's not flying in Indonesia. Maybe later, when Society for Conservation Biology, for example, Indonesia, having more weight to propose policy, for example, or scientists, or labor union, or indigenous community, we don't know, or political parties. Too bad we do not have Green Party in Indonesia. I mean, political party with green color a lot, but not green party. I mean, like the green in Europe, for example, in Latin America. We do not have that. I mean, having voices in our national parliament. So these kind of things really, I think are relevant to the discussion on why if it is good, not there. Yeah.
Okay, Masoni.
On the other question, whether we should throw the baby with the bathwater after the Vera scandal. It's a very interesting thing because if you look at what happened after this massive scandal, in fact, there was a lot of political support for these credits, right? Just after the scandal, from a number of actually philanthropic foundations led by the Children Investment Fund and a lot of not very progressive foundations, but also a lot of governments at the top. My answer to that question is, well, okay, carbon offsetting, I would just make a distinction between different types of carbon markets, right? We know that within carbon offsetting, the main issue is with avoided deforestation. It's very easy to fudge the baseline, etc. This is well known. This is very hard to address as an issue, and so that's one point. And then also I want to make a distinction between, offset markets and cap and trade markets. Offset markets, by definition, do not seek to curb emissions, right? Emissions can continue and even increase. That's what we see with aviation. Cap and trade markets are more sound, in my view, because at least there is an attempt at curbing emissions or destruction. So cap and trade is sounder. Offsets for me it never was a real option. I mean, it was kind of a false solution to buy some time, in my opinion. And what I can speak of from my perspective, where I stand, is how it's been systematically instrumentalized to avoid to distract from what needs to be done. I mean, in the case of carbon offsets, for example, the goal is to distract from public pressure to phase out fossil fuels, right, globally. Same thing happening right now with plastic offsets, right? If you see what's happening, there's a UN global plastic treaty that's being debated, right? A number of countries are saying, look, we need to put a cap on plastic production, which is obviously the thing to do. But a few oil-producing countries like Saudi Arabia, Russia, etc., and private interests are saying, no, we don't need a cap on plastic production. Instead, we will do plastic credits. So it's the same thing. It's always used politically to avoid doing what needs to be done. That's my concern on a macro level, right? And so for that reason, yes, I believe, I mean, we've had, I don't know, more than a decade of failure of carbon offsets. They've successfully delayed more public pressure for action. So I believe, yes, it's if they're stopped, I will not miss them. I understand that on a case-by-case basis, locally they may prove useful for some funding. So I think you need to distinguish. I appreciate that. But as a global solution to climate change, the fact that there's been always used to avoid, discussions about phasing out fossil fuel makes me think that they have been more of a distraction than something else. And I could tell you, I mean, I've had a lot of conversations over the years. For example, I had this conversation with a cement lobbyist in Brussels, right, about carbon markets. And the guy told me literally, he said, look, carbon markets were never meant to work. Frankly, we're happy the Paris Agreement saved them. We thought they would be long abandoned. But between you and me, we know that within 10 years, a big city like London will be underwater and they'll be dropped overnight for a carbon tax. So really what we're doing is we're buying time. So that's the perspective, the inside perspective of the sectors with harmful activities promoting this carbon offset. And I've had even worse conversation. I mean, the worst conversation I've had in my life was with the chief lobbyist, a French guy in Brussels, right? Again, about these carbon markets. And I said, look, explain to me something. I mean, the way I understand it is we've had carbon markets and that kind of failed for 15 years, right? So, and despite that, we are promoting them, we are creating new one. It doesn't make sense to me. What is the logic here? And these people are not stupid, obviously. So what am I missing? And the way I understand it is if you're a government today, you're facing two bad options, right? Either you act decisively to address climate change, and you most probably will be unpopular and probably not re-elected, possibly have a small economic recessions, or you decide not to act or act at the margin, which is pretty much the same, knowing full well what that will mean in terms of hundreds of millions of climate migrants over the coming decades and billions of deaths by the end of the century. And if you look at not the speeches, the measures that are put in place, right? It looks like we are choosing the second option, but we can't just admit to it publicly. And that sounds a bit cynical, and the guy told me literally, and I remember it because that's the most horrible conversation I had in my life. He said, look, talking about the EU, right? He said, it's pointless to do anything about climate change in the EU. It will just destroy our competitiveness and benefit the Chinese. In any event, we know that all the poor will die. The good news is it will rid us of Islam. Do you want another coffee? So my point is, yeah, and of course, this perspective is his own perspective, and it's horrible. My point is, there is a lot of cynicism around it. There's a lot of people at the highest level. Nobody really sees that, in my experience, as a viable solution, more as a useful distraction to give what they call political flexibility. To try and reconcile in appearance diverging interest. And so, for that reason, I would much prefer that we refocus the discussion on phasing out fossil fuels.
Thanks, Fred. Yes, it's really interesting as well. I mean, like if you look at like the geopolitics now with all of the war, like phasing out the fossil fuel, it might be the answer rather than going on all of these discussions. There's nothing coming out of it anyway. And it's also like I remember what you mentioned, Fred, in your other talk, the senescence of the elites, and we even see it in the popular culture, isn't it? Like Elon Musk, he's gonna just fly himself up to the Mars or whatever, and all of these rich people just building bunkers ready for the end of the day. It's quite interesting as well, isn't it? Like people that we thought have the largest mean to do some things, like Bezos just said, even if you tax me, it won't change the state of New York and the homelessness and all of the social issues there. People that we think, oh, you have a mean to do something, but they just like, oh, it's a futile attempt. I'm just going to set up this philanthropy and give like 100 billions, and I'm going to look good, and my business looks good. It's really, really. It's not weird. It's just like human nature, isn't it? And like you said, Masoni, like from logical perspective, from my regulations hat that I put on. This is like really the best regulation, but why doesn't it fly out? But I guess regulation that doesn't have a buy-in is not a good regulation. Then there's something missing, like something about human behavior, because we always like decided something and we think like we are like make a decision as a rational human being, but we are not, aren't we? And how we experience the global catastrophe. Well, we are experiencing it now. I mean, like I'm in the UK and it's so hot, and people say, "Oh, you're from Indonesia. Oh, it's so much different. We have the infrastructure, we have, the aircon, and the way we build our houses is different." So how we experience the climate crisis and the global catastrophe is different, and how the people in power, people have the means to do something about it, is different as well. I'm not an optimist in a fluffy kind of way, but I kind of always have the hope. Hope is I think like somewhere between you don't have any alternative not to try, and you just getting on day by day. I think my only hope is like with the work that we have now, and really the generation of Nabila's generation, the kind of like homogenization of experience. I think these kids, I'm old enough to call them kids, they have like same information. And if you see like the Nabila's generation in China and in London, they watch the same TikTok, they watch the same like Instagram reels, and they're quite smart. This generation, I'm like they read books, they're happy about that. I guess like that's what I see, but also like this the manosphere and all of that. I don't know. With the changing of the generation that's gonna take a lead of this, and the fact that those billionaires only how many of them, like 1% of the population, but the rest of the population is young and they're angry and they feel the injustice, and you see it's like blowing up everywhere, like the geopolitical in Nepal, in Indonesia. They're just angry and they need all of the help that they can, all of the wisdom that you, Masoni and Fred, have gained, because we are older and we see the world much in a longer time frame than they are. And what can this new generation benefit from that? And you know what, reducing, Nabila, just eating like meat once a day instead of every day eating ayam penyet is good. Changing your ayam penyet with pecel lele is good, like something like that. Like there must be something to be done, right? And something that practical, conversations that open up, like Nabila really interested in how fix the country, what is carbon trade, and then like Fred is here, like hopefully, Fred, the connection, what happening in Brussels, and like these connections are made and people can start talking to each other. I think that's quite exciting as well from my perspective. I don't really have a question. We do have another question. Anybody? So we have question in Menti matter. So some of this is quite practical. We're gonna save it for next month conversations, Nabila. But measuring bit of the credit. But I'm gonna open like 2 questions at least. One for now, like member of the audience can ask directly to Fred and Masoni about what we chat today, so we can hear like more voices from 3 of us.
While waiting, can I comment on CAP a bit? It's a bit
Oh yeah,
practical, but I think
yes,
very
yes.
interesting. So I think from the discussion we have with the Ministry of Environment in Indonesia, there has been an increasing nice idea on CAP emerging from the discussion, the latest discussion. So the idea of having, for example, biodiversity credit, it doesn't mean that whoever involved in these credit can just buy every credit. The discussion has been about maybe it is also possible, or maybe we can also introduce a cap on the credit, so that, for example, when companies, say mining companies, want to buy biodiversity credit, it needs to fulfill first its own obligations, or what is required by the regulation, say on environmental, to address environmental issues, before buying this. So there will be a cap on that, so that what have been worried about when it comes to the license to destroy, so biodiversity is considered license to destroy, will not be materializing because of there is this cap. So I like that these idea emerged during the discussion, and I would love to tell it here because of the policy process. Despite what we discussed there, I think going into a nice direction, quite healthy discussion at the moment about the ups and downs of the biodiversity credit, and this is something that I think we need to appreciate, and I hope that scientists, SCB, provide more context to this, because what I mentioned is really a big ideas, right? I can imagine what happens to species context. Elephant will be different than, say, tiger. Imagine the length of their life will be different than, say, I think Fred wrote somewhere what happens when the biodiversity credit developer just gone, no longer there. It's a long time time frame, right? So those kind of things. So we need the input from scientists, to give some what do you call it, meat to the bone. Yeah.
Thank you, Masoni. Yes, noted. Anyone wanna ask questions, or the what they take from today?
I hope they're not disappointed, yeah.
If
Because they
Yes.
expect project documents, maybe. What kind of project document for biodiversity credit we need to, maybe the next one, next session. Yeah.
Yes.
If there's no more question, I think you can ask the question about wait, where is it? Can the credit be obtained
Said.
from protected areas such as national parks? Kak Esil mentioned to me that she can help answer the question along with Pak Soni, maybe.
Yes, it's quite specific. Should we do that? Can credit be obtained from PA such as national park? Because PA usually have their own financing support from the state.
I cannot answer that because I think things are evolving in Indonesia, but I remember the discussion on carbon credit, the discussion between oh, the regulation is too rigid to, those kind of things, or we need to make it more flexible. I think there will be a range whether, it will touch on this kind of aspects. But as I mentioned earlier, I think the discussion at the moment is license can even be open now into the heart of a national park, right? I mean, the holy grail of science, I mean, this year or last year is the first time I heard about this. In the past, I mingle with foresters, with biologists, going, with them directly to national parks or sanctuaries. I never imagined this possibility. At the moment, it's like everybody's talking about this, yeah. So I don't know at the moment what will happen in next year, yeah, with this, yeah.
Can we ask for help from a friend, Kak Esil? Maybe you want to explain more about this, since this is related to her work.
No, thank you, Nabila, for giving me the opportunity. Now I wonder also how to answer and deliver that to the audience based on Pak Sony response. Well, but currently, about that, because in my current project, I work on the conserving Komodo, and then we focus on the Komodo National Park, and then one is our goal is to develop the sustainable financing, including the natural capital, to sustain the Komodo National Park long-term sustainability. So with the current initiative with the Indonesian government, the national park financing and Komodo Island is included also in one of that national park. So we try to develop and to look for some alternative, including the tourism tax to ensure the long-term sustainable finance, and then engage with the private sector, especially for the private sector who have the company concession at the national park. So we try to engage them to invest some of their to invest for the long-term of sustainable finance for the Komodo National Park. But technically,
Thank you. I think
uh-uh.
Esil, that's really great and all,
Yeah.
but we have next week to talk about like specific project. Nabila, let's save that really interesting conversation for next week, next month, or whatever you guys gonna arrange that. I really want to hear as well about like how the Komodos using biodiversity credit, or because we need to do that, right? Like people generate a lot of money from gorillas and pandas and the great Indian rhinos. Like I met them in person. The rhinos, I mean, last month. That's amazing. So I think that's all time that we have. Fred and Masoni, thank you so much. You guys been so generous with your time and the questions. And it's a combination of a lot of things in it. We go real, all of the concept of it, the how does it's implemented outside of not implemented, how does people look at it, all of this nature finance, and how does it implemented in Indonesia. And I hope you guys have a chance to look at the list of reference or material that we mentioned as well. I don't know if it's right. I choose that. Some is like Fred's work. The other one is like just really like basic, like Bob Constanza paper back in '97. The Gupta report, and I've been cheeky and sneaky in my peer, not even published yet a preprint on the last one. So I think it's really interesting conversation today is all just but conceptual of the nature of finance. How does it looks like? If you guys like me, pick up some of the really like terminology that we don't hear before, and it's fine, and you feel confused about this, and it's fine as well. And I think yes, that's all. Sonny and Fred, thank you for your time. And remember, like resources is always here as a SCB Indonesia chapter and in Asia. If there's anything else that you guys interested in order to our shared mission of saving this earth, just let us know and we can initiate another conversations. And hopefully, connection also been made. Fred also have interest to work in all of the global South country that, not only in Indonesia, but like Africa and in a lot of like area that we still have forest and biodiversity. This new interest in nature finance just take off, and we need to understand what we're dealing with if we want to, get a greater benefit from that and be less anxious or less deg-degan, as Sony said. So Nabila told me that we're gonna do pictures. That's really Indonesia. We need to have a group pictures at the end of the sessions. But before I do that, Mas Sony and Fred, do you have other last comments, other last words that you're gonna share?
I just want to say that I'm also quite hopeful in the sense that when I look at the global surveys, they show that 80% of people globally and in every country want more ambitious environmental policies. So I really take comfort into that, and I hope it translates into more action and more outcomes. But that gives me really hope.
Yeah, so similar to that, I think we know how difficult it is and policies and so on, but I think we need to find together ways to still be insane in Indonesia, still be sane, sorry, avoid being insane because of the challenges. And one way for this is to see possibilities, to keep looking at possibilities. Of course, we fully acknowledge the difficulties of this, because otherwise it will be only will be very skeptical and even, how do you call it, nihilistic about things. So it's not possible. That's why, yeah, the way we or at least I see and frame the discussion on biodiversity credit. We appreciate the critical standpoint of Fred. We discuss it also internally here, and we really appreciate the input, but also we see the modalities and Indonesia's aspirations and the multiple, different dynamics going on in Indonesia. The second one is to thank SCB for bringing this discussion. Really appreciate that. The new president, Nabila, of course, Mbak Ulan for taking the time to moderate too. And to Fred here. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. So to end things, pictures, Nabila. Well, I
Can
give it back
everyone
to you.
please open their video camera so that we can take a very nice picture of you? Of course, if you consent to them. Please open your camera. I will count 1, 2, 3, and then we all take a picture together. 1, 2, 3. Yeah, once more, please. 1, 2, 3. Okay, I think that's all. Thank you all for coming to our discussion today. We will have our next discussion about next month, but we haven't really put it together yet, and you'll hear more about this from our social media, either on LinkedIn or our Instagram. So see you on our next discussion. Thank you all.
And this call is recorded, right, Nabila?
Yes, this one is recorded.
And if everybody consent, we can upload that.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Thank